Hello and welcome back to the Cave Escape Podcast. I'm Ashton Goolsby.
And I'm Caleb Groves.
And we're back here today after our recent discussion with Mr. Greg Wilbur from New College, who was here with us for 2 episodes. We're here back again today to kind of explore some more into classical education. With we have a book Mr. Wilbur recommended to us, The Liberal Arts Tradition. We're going to kind of be reading. We're reading that together right now, so we're going to kind of talk about just the things we've come across so far as we read it, thoughts that we've had, things like that. But we wanted to start off kind of looking back at last time with Mr. Wilbur. He gave us some critiques on the way we initially had outlined some things, specifically regarding the trivium. And as we talked with him and then kind of talked with each other since then, realized some of maybe the way we had understood some of it poorly, or even things, I know for me it was things that I'd heard explained one way, and then hearing him rephrase some of it, I realized actually that's not exactly maybe how I might phrase it. Specifically, recognizing, the 3 stages still. I mean, the trivium is grammar, logic, right, or dialectic and rhetoric, but a critique he offered us was, he said the way we outlined it was possibly too utilitarian.
Yeah.
He argued it more as and you remember if you listened to episode 3, he argued it more as the language arts. So it's not necessarily I'm learning these things so that I can put them to use, so I can have the grammar of every subject and then reason it out and then make my case and get people over to my side. And the point of it is to be able to do those things. It's more of like those things were, I guess, would you say more like a side effect of...
Yeah, like they're less like only means to an end. Like we almost kind of talked about them as if they were kind of... I don't know if this is what we said initially, that like they're like means to an end. Like they're the tools of learning. You learn how to learn, and then you use those tools on the quadrivium is kind of what we said.
Yeah.
But like they are still arts in and of themselves. Like they're just as equally one of the 7 liberal arts, or 3 of them, as the quadrivium is.
Yeah.
And so they're more like there is an end in themselves, while they at the same time also point towards another end.
Yeah. And that was why he argued, because you can say that, well, every subject has a grammar and has a logic and has a rhetoric. You can say that, but then you kind of lose the sight of there's the aspect of studying language itself that you're going to lose, and that's really what we kind of have realized after that is we think of it more as the training of just using language in general, of just understanding. I said using there, that sounds utilitarian. What I mean by it is the idea of you're studying language just because it's a thing God has given to us, that we think in language. He gave us that ability, and it even says Christ is the Word.
Right.
So what does that mean? Well, by studying the trivium, you're by extension studying that aspect of Christ's revealed nature.
Yeah.
He is the Word, so you're studying grammar. What are words? What do they do? Logic, how do they relate to each other? How do they form arguments? And then rhetoric is, words are beautiful to listen to. You've poetry, right, a good speech or something. So even in that aspect, the way we'd said it before, which I've heard some critique sayers are saying it kind of like you were saying, that they're arts in and of themselves that should be studied for themselves,
right?
And that they do produce those things you can do with them in the end, but that's the point's not what you can do with them. The point is, they themselves are created and ordered and worth studying. And Mr. Wilbur talked a lot about order with us last time.
Right. Yeah. And he also talked about, I can't remember if this was in the episode or off the episode, but talked about calling them disciplines rather than arts too, especially as opposed to tools, because especially disciplines kind of makes it more like something that you do use, kind of like a tool, but it's also something that's worth something in and of itself.
Yep.
Apart from what you use it for.
Yeah.
Which is like an art is kind of feels more like it's just for the like in and of itself aspect, and tool would be like what you use it for, and discipline kind of is like a middle ground in there, which I really liked a lot.
Yeah, I really liked the way he outlined it. It was great again to have him on there with us. So great to have him come in and critique it. And we actually we recorded with him like immediately after we'd recorded episode 1, And so we had it all fresh in our minds, and we thought, all right, here we go. We've got it worked out. And we came in the next morning to talk to him, and the first thing he said was, I'm not a fan of the way you've outlined the trivium here.
Yeah, we're like, we already recorded that episode.
And we're like, all right. I guess everything we said is rubbish now. But
yeah.
But no, I mean, the point of this podcast is to have people, critique us on things so we can change the way we think about them, where we're wrong, or further understanding of things that we already knew and things like that. So I feel like that was a good example of a place where we immediately were like, oh
crap,
yeah, maybe not have that completely right.
Right. Yeah.
But as I said at the beginning, we're reading through a book right now. It's published by Classical Academic Press. It's The Liberal Arts Tradition, a Philosophy of Christian Classical Education by Kevin Clark and Ravi Scott Jain. So it's actually, it's been around for a while, but they just recently, I think it was 2019, it says, they published it, and it says it has...
2021, actually.
Oh, really? 2021?
So first edition was 2014. And then 2019, I think 2019 is the one where they added like 40% more content. And so that's why there's the note in the beginning. But then third edition is 2021.
Well, Mr. Wilbur, as I said at the beginning, he recommended this to us, and we've read the introduction. We've just read part 1 so far, but I've thoroughly enjoyed it.
Every page of this book has blown my mind.
Yeah, it's one of those I don't normally. I've come to the point where I recognize I have to write in books at some point, but it was so nice and clean when I got it. I thought I don't want to write in it, but I couldn't get but a couple pages in, and I've graffitied all the pages now. They've got so many underlines and notes on them.
Yep.
So I guess we just want to jump right in.
Yeah.
So it's divided into different sections. The first section they talk about, they title it Piety and Poetic Knowledge.
Well, first, before that, I wanted to talk about their kind of intro to the whole book.
Okay.
Where they go over like their paradigm.
Mm-hmm.
They kind of give it like an overview of what their paradigm for what a classical education should look like.
Oh, yeah.
And they use they have like this acronym PGMAPT.
Yep.
I don't know if they would say it PG mapped, but that's how I've been saying it in my head. Which stands for piety, gymnastics, music, arts, which is for the liberal arts, and then philosophy and theology. And so those are like there's like 6 stages almost.
And they intend that like a hierarchy, kind of you begin at one end and move to the theology at the end.
Yeah. And so then that's kind of the way that the book is laid out, is the first section is piety and poetic knowledge. So it goes through the section on piety, section on gymnastics and music, and then it goes to liberal arts, and then it goes to the rest of them. And then there's kind of a section at the end, I think, that is more kind of summative and like more practical stuff, I think, as far as I know. I don't know. I haven't read it. It's just the table of contents. But
yeah.
I mean, was there anything that stood out to you in that little intro section?
Well, I did love he has a quote here. He says, it's at the bottom of page 4, and he says, "It is for this goal of passing along a culture that the curriculum existed." So he makes the argument that education's goal is to pass on some type of culture.
Yeah.
So for the ancient Greeks, they're passing on their Greekness. But, obviously now for us, we're not passing on American culture, even Western culture. We're passing along the Christian culture to these children.
Yeah.
So
and that's the whole, like the idea of the paideia.
Yeah.
Is like means enculturation almost.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
Which I thought was super interesting. And that's part of the trickiness of trying to do classical education in today's world is that we don't even really have a culture that we're trying to pass on.
Yeah.
Which is why I think it's super important that the classical education be Christian, because then we do have, like you said, that Christian culture that we're passing on.
Yeah.
But I do think that we're still missing something by not having as much of a national culture that we pass on. Like in Greece, you were from Athens, or you were from Thebes, or like you were from Sparta, and it was like that was where you were from and that was your identity. And we don't really have that anymore. And so there's not like as much of that kind of that aspect of a person's identity to pass on through education.
Yeah, well, I think I've asked you this before, but have you read The Need for Roots by Simone Weil?
I've not. I will be this semester though for more philosophy.
Yeah, it's with Johnson, right?
Yep.
Yeah. That was a book I didn't quite get to finish all of it. Actually, I finished the last half and didn't get to read all the first half, which going back and looking at it was the best part. But She talks in that book about, she's talking about her own society in France. I think it was in the 1940s, maybe. But the idea of, and it's even truer today, it's a society that can move around so easily. We've lost this sense of culture, because you have like German culture. Germany wasn't a country for the longest time, but there was this idea of German culture, and even Greece had this at one point, where there were all these different city-states,
right?
But they had this idea of Greekness with them, and it's because they were very tied to their town. And even in Germany, they're small little countries,
right?
Or sorry, they're more like cities, but because that's where they live, that's where their parents grew up, and why would you leave? It's dangerous out there to move. But now with things like cars and especially airplanes, I mean,
right.
I can travel around the world in less than 48 hours,
Right.
or possibly less than 24. I've never tried it, but just that idea of I can get up and move so easily. We don't have this idea of culture or placement anymore. Everything seems, even relationships to an extent, seem replaceable.
Right.
So trying to even recover that idea of being part of your own community wherever you are. There's an element in which education, I mean, you need that in your Christian life. You need to be oriented toward church, but even that ties into geographically where you located as well.
Right.
You've got to have some type of roots to go with it, or it just makes an unstable person. So education, you have to have this cultivation of roots of some kind in order for it to create a well-rounded, stable individual.
Yeah. So the first part of the book is piety and poetic knowledge, and so he spends his first little chunk talking about what piety is. And one thing that he says is piety shapes our being and identifies who we are, which I thought was super interesting. And it kind of goes with what we were just talking about with that idea, like almost like patriotism, kind of.
Yeah.
Like was something they never used the word patriotism, but that was one of the things that I was kind of had in my head as something that would fall under that category. Cicero defined pietas as the virtue that admonishes us to do our duty to our country, our parents, or other blood relations. I just thought this whole section was super interesting because it like gave a way more broad and like full definition and understanding of what piety actually is. Mm-hmm. Because I think when most people hear the word piety or pious, you think of like monks or like people who are just like super like devotion. Like piety is almost like a synonym with devotion. I mean, you could actually sort of, I guess, kind of say that still, even with the way that they present it in the book, but it's way more than that. It's not merely devotion.
Yeah, it puts it in a much larger context than I think we're used to hearing it in.
Right. And like piety, like you don't, like I was even just talking with one of my roommates about this, and it's not like you have piety towards something. Like it's not like you have piety towards your country or your religion or your ancestors or whatever. It's you just have piety. It's like this mindset, this quality that you develop, which then like causes you to have a certain mindset towards religion and your country and your family and your ancestors and stuff. But it's not like you have a specific piety towards blank.
Yeah.
Which I thought was interesting because we don't, like I said, we don't really think of piety that way. And Calvin, it even talks about, Calvin like said that you could sum up the goal of the Christian life almost, I think is how they phrase it.
Yeah, I was looking there too.
The entire calling of the Christian life, it would be piety, or it's often translated godliness.
I loved his, it was under Calvin, a quote by Thomas Aquinas, or Thomas, as Mr. Spun would call him. He says, as by the virtue of piety, man pays duty and worship not only to his father in the flesh, but also to all his kindred on account of their being related to his father. So by the gift of piety, he pays worship and duty not only to God, but also to all men on account of their relationship to God.
Yeah.
So putting it in context of loving because God loves first, just learning to and I was just talking with my roommate Jeremiah about this last night, but the idea of, like as Augustine talks about, like ordering your loves, recognizing there's a sense in which we're called to love the things that God loves, certainly, but also learning how to love them in the right order. Because there's certain things that should be at the top, but God should always be number one.
Right.
So it's not necessarily bad to love all these other things above other things. You just need to make sure that they're still beneath God.
Right. Yeah.
But
I even thought he has this quote where this guy's got, I guess, I don't know if it's a commentary on Cicero or something, but he's talking about Cicero. This is Russell Kirk, a quote from him, saying, "A pious man in the Roman understanding was one who fulfilled his duties, religious and social, one who subordinated one who subordinated his own desires to the claims of others."
Mm-hmm.
And Cicero said, "Piety is the foundation of all other virtues."
Yeah, I like that idea that piety's the one that forms all the other virtues in there.
Right.
You've got one that's kind of inside all the other ones.
Right. Yeah, it's almost like a pre. It's like the pre-virtue, kind of, I guess.
Yeah. I also liked over where he says, they're talking about the idea of that it's the church forms the student, not the school, and that's something that I've kind of, and some of this I'm sure it's just my own personal frustration in the day, but feeling sometimes as if it's almost as if I'm expected to discipline the child and in the context of the class during the day,
Mm-hmm.
and I'm the one that's supposed to be forming them to love what's good and love God and those things. And that's the point of sending them to school. I feel like it's what some parents think.
Right. Yeah.
But also trying to communicate to them, my job is not to get the student to act that way or think that way about these things. My job is to enforce what's already there.
Right.
So my job is to build off of a foundation that should be provided elsewhere. So they come into it assuming that they're being nurtured elsewhere, that they're growing, they're being read the word, they're being read stories, they're being given these things, and my job is just merely to back it up and kind of reinforce it in some ways.
Yeah. Which is the tricky thing with trying to recover classical education out of modern education. Because currently, like, all of the people who are raising kids, for the most part, have been brought up and educated within the like the modern education system, and so that's how they think about it. Is school is just a place where the kids go to learn how to be people.
Yeah.
Which, like, education doesn't just happen at school, though. That's the thing. Like, education is how you learn how to be a person, in that very unclear and vague way of putting it.
Yeah.
But education isn't just school. Education is your whole life, and education is in the home. It's at church, and even if you're not a Christian, you don't go to church, there's still a lot of life that's not spent in school. And if you're not optimizing that time, I don't like that word. That made me super uncomfortable to say. That's super utilitarian. If you're not using the time that you have in, I'm only thinking of the word optimizing right now. Like, if you're trying to, like, being fruitful and using, like, you don't want to waste your time, but wasting your time doesn't mean always being busy. Because, like, again, like, I'm just dancing around so many words that mean different things in modern world. Because, like, in the modern world, if you think, oh, wasting your time is like not being productive.
Yeah.
Which I love the way that Mr. Orr talks about the difference between productivity and fruitfulness, and like shifting your mindset from needing to like be productive all the time, but being fruitful. Like, and he talks about it in school specifically, but I think it applies everywhere. If you think about using your time to bear good fruit, then it completely shifts the way that you think about what you're doing and the things that you're getting from what you're doing. Whereas if you're thinking about it as like productivity, then you're just part of a machine, and you're just like producing, you're like a factory, and you're just a machine that's producing a specific thing. And if you're not, then like you're a bad machine, and you're not using your time well. But like you can spend time just sitting and doing nothing, and that can be time well spent.
Well, it's even the idea of like Sabbath, like he even says,
exactly,
because like he always encouraged us. He said when the Sabbath rolls around, of course, like the idea of like if your ox is in a ditch, I mean, pull it out. But he said if your ox is in a ditch every Sunday, there's probably something deeper going on there. But he said it always stick with me the way he said, if you get to the Sabbath and you realize your work's not done, that's okay. Right. Your work is never going to be completely done.
Exactly.
But Christ commands us to rest anyway. So the commandment's not if your work is done, sit down and have a rest. The commandment is rest, knowing your work is not done, but Christ will accomplish it. Christ is over all, and it will be accomplished. But rest. You can rest knowing that Christ is sovereign. And so I always loved hearing him say that.
Yeah.
And sometimes you needed to hear him say that.
For sure. Yeah. But yeah, the actual quote from the book is like, the work of school thus depends on the Christian formation students receive in the church and family, but school must develop and support that foundation. So that's even more, we even just kind of were talking about it just being like supporting it, but that's interesting saying like that school develops it too. So like they get this formation, but then because you do spend a lot of time in school, so like a large part of your education is done by school, and it is more intentional education. Your whole life is like education and formation of your character.
Yeah,
but
yeah.
in school, it's like specifically, intentionally, this is now we're doing education. Yep. And so I think that makes a lot of sense that it's not necessarily it shouldn't be the actual foundation of your education, because that should be done by your family and your like church community, but developing the things that the formations that happen in those places, like developing it further.
Well, I also like the way that they put down here the credo ut intelligam, the I believe that I may understand, and then quotes Proverbs,
yeah.
the fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom, Proverbs 9:10. So that if even in Scripture, it's the understanding is you're beginning from that culture of loving the Lord, and that love of the Lord should be what leads you through education. Which for me, that's the part that gets me excited. I think I was just telling you this Saturday when we were hanging out, holding up the wall at my cousin's house. But what gets me excited is, and it sounds cheesy, I had some parents a couple weeks ago ask me, why'd you get into teaching? Why'd you get into teaching? And it sounded kind of corny to say it at the time, but it's true. Just seeing a love of Scripture, but then seeing the subjects put in light of creation and God's divine order, that's what I love about classical education. That's what gets me excited to go in when I see my students starting to make those connections across. I'm like, this to me, I think is what we're actually supposed to be doing.
Right.
Is not merely can the kids say 2 + 2 is 4, 3 + 3 is 6. All right, they got a basic understanding of these ideas, but it's when they understand, I can take two things, I can understand two-ness, put 2 with 2, and I get more things, and I can predict what I'm going to get.
Yeah.
Because God is a God of order and God of reason. And so it's not just like Mr. Wilbur, I think, said, I can't remember if it was on the recording or if it was off.
Right.
He said a lot of great things off the recording too. But the idea of, it's not just, well, God created math and God is beautiful, therefore math must be beautiful. But
Right.
It has a beauty to it that you can only begin to fully grasp when you begin with a love of God. And ultimately,
Right.
I mean, we can't fully grasp it anyway,
Right.
but we can begin that process when we begin with the fear and admonition of the Lord, as it says in Proverbs.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we should probably move on to the next section,
Probably.
since we're probably going to talk more about that part.
Let's talk about gymnastics.
Although right there at the end, talking, his piety is the central tenet of Christian classical education. Before learning can begin, this quote is so good. Before learning can begin, there must be an education in love.
Yes.
And that's kind of what piety does, is that it teaches you the love of kind of your duties, I guess.
Yeah.
And by teaching you what your duties are and to care about those things, then that readies you to love and want to go and study the liberal arts and like all the other parts of the rest of your education.
Well, it's something I know Doug Wilson says. When you have a small child, your job with a small child, a lot of times we want to look at a younger kid and go, well, they don't really understand the rules yet. When they're older and they know the rules, and we can hold them accountable to a standard, but when they're little, they're still learning. He says, hold them accountable to the standard from day one. Yeah. He says, teach them to love it, though.
Right.
He said, because you can teach the kid what the standard is, and when they get older and you start putting rules on them, they grow to hate those rules and things.
Right.
But if you give them to the kid
sense.
when they're younger and they grow up with them, they find rest and comfort in that.
Right.
And when you get to the teenage years, rather than most people want to put rules on, he says that's where you should start pulling them off He said, if you've done your job correctly, you'll actually notice the kid doesn't want to do the bad things because he's been raised with this standard, and he just loves those things. So that in his mind, obviously no one's perfect, but overall he doesn't want to do the things that he's not supposed to do because he's been trained to love the good things.
Exactly. And it's not like one of the things that I think of when I think of like the importance of things like that is I think of people like the average like modern person, I guess. I don't really know what to call them, saying like somebody like that would be potentially wary of doing that because it sounds like it's like brainwashing almost. Yeah. Because truth isn't objective really. And so it's like who are you to like teach them to just like assume that this is good and that this is bad rather than letting them figure it out for themselves, because really everything's about rationality and you can reason your way to goodness. I mean, okay, actually we're kind of past that. Actually, that's I'm still stuck in the like early 1900s because that's where we are in moral philosophy. So yeah, maybe just disregard everything I just said there. But there's a quote in the book that just goes to what you're talking about. These practices, talking about developing the culture of the school, should be one the culture of the school should be one that encourages and develops piety in its students, just like in the way that the school operates. And these practices curb individual autonomy, the pervasive malady of modernity, and situate the student in space and time, or better yet, in place and history, which I can definitely hear people having huge problems with just the way that they chose to phrase that, which I thought was pretty bold.
They phrased it very intentionally.
They did, yeah. But like even when I read the word curb individual autonomy, I was like, okay, hold on, wait a second, that sounds wrong, But then I thought about it, and I was like, no, actually that makes a lot of sense, because you don't. And then, it explains it by like right there at the end, placing them in place and history. We're not like individual people. We're not alone in where we are. Mm-hmm. Like we have this whole history of humanity, of moral philosophy and all of these like social developments and everything that's led up to where we are now. But if we're going to have individual autonomy, then that means disregarding everything that was before. And then kind of like what I was just saying, just like letting everybody figure out right and wrong for themselves.
Yeah.
And each individual person has autonomous like authority over their own character development, which sounds really good to like post-enlightenment ideals, but really it's actually problematic because total depravity.
Whoa, pulling out the Calvinist guns there. See?
Whoops. But I don't even think you have to go there to say that it's wrong, because humans thrive in community, and we discover truth in dialogue with others. Mm-hmm. And if everybody worked in a vacuum, nobody could actually arrive at what is the full truth, I think.
Yeah.
That, and you would have a bunch of people who would thought that they had arrived at the truth, but hadn't, and would all arrived in different places. And so then you're just back to like subjective, non-existent truth.
Yeah, that is true. Which is one thing I always valued about the Socratic discussion model. But the way we always had so many people with differing opinions in class, and there sometimes they look at you and want to murder you for it.
Right.
But at the end of the day, like, you have all these different thoughts, and they're bouncing off each other, and iron sharpens iron. You're gonna grow.
Yeah.
Through that experience.
Yeah, even if you disagree with other people, it's super valuable to hear the way that they think about it and like what their opinion actually is, because oftentimes it does shape my own opinion.
Oh yeah, definitely.
About like the thing.
So they move on to talk about the two, gymnastics and music. They say come before even the arts themselves. So you got piety, but then you move on to you get this idea of gymnastics and music. And so he talks about, which is one thing I remember. I think it was Mr. Wilbur brought it up, and everybody else talked about it in their classes. But the idea of I think this is I think part of this has to do with, I would probably blame it partly on the enlightenment, or a large portion on the Enlightenment.
When in doubt, blame it on the Enlightenment.
Put that on a bumper sticker. But the idea, we forget too often that we are composite, body and soul. And so a lot of times we think purely physical. So we have,
Right.
and if anybody brings up the idea of a soul, we're like, all right, you're getting a little hokey pokey there.
Right.
You're getting into this weird mystic stuff.
Mm-hmm.
Well, we know. I mean, we know if you're really sick, go to a doctor.
Right.
Go to a hospital and let them take care of you. But there's
Right. Especially when we talk about like educating the soul, and the soul
Yeah.
being like a thing that you can actually like harm or
Mm-hmm.
benefit. Like I
Yeah.
feel like that's even more weird than just talking about the existence of a soul, because a lot of people would be okay with you talking about souls
yeah.
as long as you're not talking about them as
Yeah,
a part
yeah,
of
yeah.
your person.
But then there's also it's interesting too, because I feel like we also a lot of times fall into this idea of education is purely intellectual, and
Yeah.
there's not the physical stuff, the sports and stuff. All right, that's extra. All that's extracurricular. That's fun
Right.
if you have time. The athletic people get involved in athletics. I mean, as a not athletic person, I kind of wish that was true. But they talk here about the idea of, because we are body and soul, we need to have these two arts of gymnastics and music that educate and form those two aspects. So
Right.
he's saying the gymnastics is its training is concerned to the entire physical condition of the child. He says if you don't have a well-disciplined body, how can you expect your soul, the other part of you, to then be disciplined as well?
Right.
You have to. Yeah, that should be kind of like a. I guess it would be fair to say, an outward exhibition of the state of your soul in a sense.
Yeah.
That might
Yeah,
be a
I
little
think it's
far.
like it's like the
I don't think that's exactly how I meant to phrase that.
like the it's not, oh well, yeah, we're body and soul, so we're gonna train our body and we're gonna train our soul, but they're totally separate, because body and soul, like they're not, like body and soul are very, very interconnected. And so because of that, the training of your body affects your soul, and the training of your soul affects your body. And like a super practical, like super clear way that works is the discipline required in physical training is like, it's a physical discipline, but it's also very much a mental discipline,
Oh yeah.
which then you can apply to other more like mental or even like spiritual activities. Like academically, mental discipline is super helpful, and the easiest way to get mental discipline is through physical training.
That is true.
And then in the same way that you're training your soul and shaping your soul and like ordering the appetites also is kind of how it's phrased. Tuning your heart to the real is how they phrase it in the book, which I thought was super dope. Then it's like ordering your desires.
Yep.
And when your
back to that
desires are
ordering
ordered,
of loves again.
yeah, back to the ordering
Back
love.
to
And so
Augustine.
but then that once those are ordered, then that affects your actions
Yeah.
and your physical actual like things that you do in the physical realm. And so both of them are very connected to each other. So it's not just we're going to train our body to get strong and we're going to train our soul to like be good, I guess. But they're both like mutually beneficial.
Yeah. Because there's even the aspect, I'm thinking, because I ran cross country in high school for 2 years, but that idea of you're learning, and they would tell us all the time, they said, this is training and doing hard things, because everything in your body is screaming to quit.
Yeah.
And a thing was, you run and you say, I'm get that tree. I'm going to make it to that tree. And you get to that tree and you say, that pole.
Yep.
And you keep going. But it's that idea of pushing yourself even when everything in your body screams quit. And so you're training, you're physically training, like your body's getting stronger, but also there is even a shaping of like your mind in there that goes on of
Right.
the physical endurance, but you're also just learning as a human how to endure and push through and do things because they're worth doing.
Yeah. I also thought it was very cool. This is something that I already was kind of aware of, but the idea of music, like we're talking about gymnastics and music, and gymnastics, I don't know if we explicitly said, but gymnastics being not flips and splits, but like like general like bodily training, like working out, running, and like swimming. Like a lot of it was like running, swimming.
Yep.
I forget what the third thing is that they listed in the thing, in the book, but
yeah.
So that's kind of what that was.
I think Mr. Wilbur did mention that last time because I think it came up briefly with him on.
Oh yeah.
I think it was last time. But yeah, I forgot we don't just mean like the Olympics today.
Right. Yeah. Right. But then also music being not just playing instruments, but like all of the arts inspired by the muses, which they list as also poetry, so like music obviously, but then also poetry and drama, the fine arts and literature. And then as the muses Cleo and Urania suggest, history, geography, and even astronomy are musical subjects as well. And so like those, like it's almost like all of the, at least the quadrivium, I mean really just all the liberal arts are kind of like there, but you're not studying the liberal arts, you're studying the musical arts, and you're studying them. I forget exactly how they phrased it in the book, but they kind of make that distinction between this isn't studying the liberal arts, but it's tuning your heart to that which is real, and kind of like preparing that. It's like a, I'm trying to think of the farming analogy, where you prepare the ground. It's like tilling the soil, maybe, tilling the soil, like preparing the soil for then the liberal arts to come.
Fertilizing it, maybe?
Yeah, fertilizing it. Yeah. I guess, I don't know. I feel like there's a concise way to say that. But then the quadrivium, or not the quadrivium, the liberal arts, like you prepare the soil for those to then like flourish and grow when you study them.
I've always loved, and for me, the music section was the one that got me the most excited.
Yeah.
Because a lot of this is stuff that we already talk about on our own.
Right.
Because
we're already obsessed with music.
Yeah. And I remember Mr. Hafner saying this in Harmonia. Music is shaping the soul. And it's kind of what Mr. Wilbur was saying last time when we asked him to talk about the idea of if we could say there's one culminating art in the quadrivium, which is cosmology or harmonia. Right. And he said he'd be more inclined to say harmonia, which I would as well. But because it's the idea of not just music, but the idea of harmony, and you're studying order. So yes, it's like I was trying to tell somebody the other day who was mathematically inclined. I think it was a parent of one of my students was talking about their son he's a math kid, but he's having to take piano, and he's not a huge fan of piano. And I said, but if he realizes the way it works out mathematically, so you can approach it from really everybody should love studying music in one way or the other. Either it's just beautiful and you enjoy it that way, right? Or if you're not that way, mathematically it works out that way. Scientifically, vibration. I mean, you can approach it from
That's true.
Dozens of different ways.
That's actually cool. I've not really thought about it in that context before.
But the way that there's something about a certain song makes you want to get up and dance. A certain song makes you want to sit still and listen. Or even some pieces they play and you feel yourself lean in to listen to it. There's something about the way it moves your soul. Yeah. In a way that nothing else does.
That's one of the things that is like fascinated me more than anything else for a while, is like how music affects you spiritually. Like a concert pianist can play a piece and make you feel an emotion, and it can like affect you mentally and emotionally and spiritually too. Like especially like even Augustine talked about in his book on music. Well, actually, I don't know if it was that or if it was in something else, but in this commentary that I'm reading on his book on music, the lady talks about, Carol Harrison talked about how he experienced like some church music and it moved him emotionally and spiritually. Like it moved his soul towards like a worship and love of God. But just hearing the music, it had nothing to do with what the words were or any of that. It was just the sound of the music, which is just crazy that there are vibrations in the air that affect something that's not physical.
Yeah. Well, it's even like, the early church recognized this. You didn't do freshman music.
I did not.
But if you go through church history, there was this question at the beginning of, well, what music do we allow? Because you have the pagans had music and they had instruments and all kinds of things in there, and so initially it was stated a cappella. It has to be a cappella.
Right.
It has to be very simple, and the reason for it was, as Julie exhibited all the time at New College, if you sing it, it's easier to remember.
Right.
And so they said, in the sense of memory or conveying some type of message through it, that's fine. But it's got to be very simple. And
Right.
so that's why you get a lot of this chance, all the chance of like one note with very slight variation. So if you do something like Credo in unum Deum, but it's all kind of sitting on that one note.
Right.
Because I said it's got to have variation to be music, but very simple, very simple.
Right. And even that kind of, I think that probably comes from like Plato and other like other like philosophers, like saying like the performance of music isn't actually what's good about music. Like this idea of like the like sensuous music, like the music that's sensed isn't actually like where the good of studying music comes from. But Augustine was like one of the first people to take that and flip it and like actually say no, actually music sensed is important, and like it does have an effect on us spiritually, and it is an important part of studying music as a liberal art. Which then, when I realized that, then I kind of realized, oh, this is kind of, I mean, it's like tangential, but it was a super interesting thought that like Augustine was adding something new there. People had said this stuff about what education was supposed to be in the liberal arts for hundreds of years, and then Augustine was like, actually, no, we need to add this thing in there. There's this new thing that we now need to add because of, and like the Christian, like later Christian like theologians and people who did work on the liberal arts also kind of developed that idea of the actual sound of the music being super important. And so that then kind of made me realize that we need to be careful about saying, oh, everything that they said back then about what education was supposed to be is correct, and there's nothing that we should try and add to what classical education should be today. And like just like we like to be wary of just studying what like the ancients said and what Augustine said, and like kind of people who developed it from there, and like be careful of saying we shouldn't add anything, because knowledge is progressive, and there's no point at which we then like know all of the things. And so I guess really it's just like a warning against chronological snobbery, and saying fallacy, but like reverse fallacy. Right. And saying, oh no, the ancients are all right, and anything modern and new is bad. The ancients had it all right all the way back then. But then also like the opposite of that being they were like kind of silly. We've learned new stuff at this point, so we know that they were wrong, and so we should just disregard them. But it's like both. They were right, but we've learned new stuff. Yeah. And now we just learn how to reconcile the new stuff that we've learned about created order and how that fits into this system of education and study in created order that has already been given to us by all of these people, because we are in history. Back to like what we were talking about before, we are part of a greater story. And so to just disregard everything that's come before is to cut off all of our limbs and then try and run a race.
Well, that's part of why my class, my fourth grade class, is finishing up right now a section on astronomy. So we've been talking about astronomy since Christmas, and they've got their final test tomorrow. But one of the questions on there is, how many planets did the ancient Greeks say there were? Because even though we now know, thanks to people like Copernicus, that the Earth is not the center of the universe.
Right.
It's the sun. We go around the sun, not the other way around. It's still, I would still argue it's very important that they understand, and I tried simply to walk them through, this is how for the longest time the ancients understood the solar system. This is why, and this is the development to what we understand now. But it's funny because so many people would argue, and I think even some people I've talked to were like, okay, that's extra nerdy information. Why do they need to know that. It's not relevant anymore, but it is.
Yeah.
It's fundamental to how we understand how we got where we are.
Yeah.
But there's even the benefit of reading history through that lens, and even scripture and things through the lens. So even if you take things that we now know aren't, though, well, that's not 100% how it works anymore.
Right.
I feel like, again, post Enlightenment, we want everything to be very rational and reasoned out, and to look at something like the Ptolemaic view of the solar system and say, well, the Earth's obviously not the center. We know the sun is the center. Throw it out. You lose something by not even observing where they were wrong.
Yeah.
So there's the idea of, I mean, you can't do the chronological snobbery. Well, it's older, so it must be better. Clearly, it's better to know we go around the sun,
right?
The Earth.
Yeah.
But also there's a level of respecting what they've said, in the sense of they are the ones who came before us, and respecting them and learning from their mistakes as well.
Right.
Even
Piety.
even where their mistakes. Piety. But then the last line of this section, kind of to wrap it all up, and kind of as they're moving on to the next section, he says, the art of the trivium and the quadrivium to which we now turn takes root in the rich soil of a musical and gymnastic education. So moving through that acronym they gave us at the beginning, we've got the piety, then he looks at gymnastics, and then music, and these are the fundamentals that get us then to the arts.
Yeah.
So it's this progression, not again, not trying to be utilitarian. We do A so we can get to B so we can get to C, but we're moving through them in this progression, in this pattern.
Yeah.
So that brings us to a conclusion for today. As usual, we'll have a brief synopsis up on the blog of what we're talking about. Please feel free to leave comments there, or if you're somewhere like YouTube where there's comments enabled and you have any critiques, questions, or if you have any recommendations of other places that we could go look to learn more about this ourselves, or that others could as well.
Yeah.
Feel free to leave that stuff for
Please.
us. As always, thank you for listening. Tune back in next week and take care.